And we are now joined by Rabbi Bill Plevan, who, in addition to being a rabbi, also is a PhD and teaches Jewish philosophy, theology, and ethics in a variety of institutions and adult educational settings in New York. Rabbi Bill Plevan, great to be here with you.
Wonderful to be with you, Rabbi Rosen. Thank you so much. And thanks to Rabbi Gerber and the Rabbinical Assembly for organizing this. It's wonderful to be with everyone. Chag Sameach. May it be a joyous Chag full of insight and full of joy and wishes of and blessings of peace. I'm teaching on the subject of Abraham Joshua Heschel on the notion of freedom and freedom as responsibility. I'm going to introduce the topic through a few philosophical reflections, as well as reference to a text that I think forms the background of Heschel's writings, even though I don't think he cites it in this particular essay that I'm focusing on, but I'm certain that Heschel is kind of really offering a kind of extended interpretation of this passage from Pirkei Avot that I'm sure many of you have come across in the past. I'll get to that text in a moment. I'll just say I'm focusing on an essay that Heschel wrote in 1958 called "Religion in a Free Society," and it was a paper given at a conference called "Religion in a Free Society." So he was addressing the topic of the conference. So it was a multi-faith conference of scholars and leaders in American religion at that time in 1958. And it's interesting to think about, this is before Heschel becomes very active in the civil rights and the anti-war movements. But you can see kind of the kernel of Heschel's political vision, or the relationship between Judaism and broader social issues in this writing. And I think it's a very helpful way of giving insight into the way that Heschel thought about his later activity. Just by way of opening, in thinking about the question of freedom, we very often think of freedom in what I'm going to call a kind of a negative sense. I don't mean negative in the sense of bad, but in the sense of freedom as the absence of something. Freedom as the absence of constraints on our ability to do things. Freedom is being able to do whatever it is that we want to do, meaning that nothing is standing in our way. And we could imagine different types of things that could stand in our way. And I'll say a little bit more about that as we go on. So freedom could be understood as the absence of interference, or the absence of a threat of interference for doing whatever it is that one chooses. But when we think about freedom in that way, as we go down the road in thinking about what that looks like in our personal lives and in social and political lives, we might find that concept of freedom lacking, this kind of what I'm calling the negative conception of freedom. Now, it's obvious that, of course, people commit wrongdoing, they commit acts of evil and harm other people. So immediately we might think that that perhaps we should define freedom differently, right? If freedom means doing whatever it is you wish to do, some people seem to wish to do harm to other people, and that may be a minority of people, but it's still a significant question as to, well, what do we think about the types of constraints that we want to put on our behavior as a society, whether that takes the shape of formal law or other types of constraints that we have in various different kinds of social settings that put constraints on behavior, or that threaten punishments for various kinds of moral, social, legal infractions, whatever they might be. And it might occur to us then that the concept of freedom as just the absence of constraints might be limiting in some way. I'll say a little bit more about what the options are here. But before I do that, I'd like to look then at this text from Pirkei Avot, which is the first text I have on page 1. And this is an excerpt of the text. There's more in the text there, which is fascinating. The text itself is fascinating and worth its own much more in-depth study. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, thank you for putting it up here. Okay, so there it is on the screen. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, every day a bat kol, a heavenly voice, goes forth from Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai, right, proclaiming and saying, "Woe unto humanity for their contempt towards the Torah." And it says, right, and so in continuing this drash of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, it says, "And the tablets were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God graven upon the tablets." So this is a quote from the book of Exodus when God writes the tablets for Moses again after the golden calf incident. And here is this fairly well-known, I think, midrash that you shouldn't read charut, which is graven. So the word in the biblical verse that's graven upon the tablets, that the writing was graven upon the tablets. That's a straightforward understanding of what's going on there. It says, read it instead of graven, read cherut, freedom. And what is the meaning of this very bold interpretation? I won't get into, if I had more time, perhaps I'd say more about why is Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi even think he's justified in offering such an interpretation? But he thinks he is. It's a very creative and compelling midrash. And he tells us the meaning of the midrash too. And it says, "For no one is free unless they occupy themselves with the study of the Torah." So whatever it is that is going on here with this midrash, and whatever it is that Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi is doing here, we clearly get a sense from Pirkei Avot of a conception of freedom within rabbinic Judaism, within the Judaism of the Talmud anyway, that sees freedom as connected integrally to the responsibility of observance of the Torah. So that freedom is not the absence of constraint. So whatever conception of freedom the Torah is working with, or I should say, whatever conception of freedom Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi and maybe the rabbis, we could say the rabbis of the Talmud more generally, are working with, it's not freedom as the absence of constraint, it's freedom as responsibility. So whatever, I think that Heschel in this article, Religion in a Free Society, is attempting in a way to flesh out what freedom as responsibility means in Judaism. So before we get there, and if we could have the page 1 of the sheet put back up again for people to look at, this is helpful. So I want to kind of give us a kind of philosophical framing of different conceptions of freedom. And we might mean different things by freedom. So if you're on page 1, what I've written there is 2 conceptions of freedom of the will. The first is freedom. So here I'm distinguishing between freedom of the will and political freedom, which we might mean something slightly different by the two of them. So freedom of the will, one conception of freedom of the will is just the freedom means the capacity to choose among various courses of action. So this is a question that philosophers will ask is, well, do human beings really have free will? Or do animals perhaps also have free will, even though we may not think of them as having it? This is a kind of interesting philosophical question and perhaps important, right? When I choose to refrain from having that second piece of cheesecake at the Tikkun, Leil Shavuot, that I might be attending, hopefully in person at some point, am I really making that choice, or is there something actually going on with me that something else is constraining me, right? So we normally think that, you know, to take a kind of standard physics example, that falling objects are constrained by gravity, let's say, right? But when we normally think of our own actions, we think, well, I'm not constrained by gravity. I'm making a choice to have that second piece of cheesecake. But some philosophers might question that and say, or psychologists, right, might question that and say, well, you're not really choosing that. There's some sort of constraint going on. There's something that's forcing you to do that. And then how do you understand that? Well, obviously human beings and rocks are different, but are they that different? How are they different? I don't really want to focus on that question. There's another conception of freedom of the will, which is number 2, which isn't incompatible with the first type of freedom, but it's an additional conception, an additional sort of element of freedom of the will. And in this one, freedom means the capacity to choose what we ought to do, right from wrong, good as opposed to evil. Now, if one holds this conception of freedom of the will, you don't necessarily have to agree or think that we know everything about what it is to know right from wrong. One might say, well, there are all sorts of areas about what's right from wrong that people have reasonable disagreements about, that we might not really fully understand, that we need to think about it a little bit more. But the very idea, though, that freedom of my individual will involves the process of choosing right from wrong is very distinct from number one. It's not incompatible with number one, right? In a sense, position number two includes position number one. But sometimes philosophers just want to focus on question number one. They don't really want to think about question number two, but then there are other thinkers that really want to focus on number two and say, well, what freedom really means, and in fact, what makes human freedom particularly important and precious as a value, is that human beings are going through a process of deciding what's right from wrong and striving to actually make the right choice. And that's somehow integral to freedom, right? If having that second piece of cheesecake is the wrong choice, right, then my freedom really is constituted, or really, my freedom is really realized by making the right choice about the cheesecake. I'm not going to tell you what the right choice is. You're going to have to decide that on your own at the Tikkun. And maybe the right choice is different for everybody. I think when Heschel is writing about freedom, he's really focusing on this number two. That's really the argument that he's making, is that real freedom is the freedom that emerges within human beings when we strive to make the right choices, and when we actually succeed in refraining from evil. We'll see the texts that show that that's what Heschel's trying to say. But before we go into that, I want to share this concept of political freedom, because Heschel really is also talking about religion in a free society. I think it's less clear to me what he means by political freedom in this essay. So I'll say exactly what it is that I have in mind here when we talk about it. But one of the things that Heschel says very emphatically is that freedom is much more than just the absence of constraints. So in the history of modern political thought, one conception of political freedom is freedom as the social and political absence of constraints, right? And that's often called liberal freedom or libertarian freedom. And I'll say I'm going to use the terms liberal, libertarian, and republican. Those really refer to strands in political thought, in modern political thought in particular. They don't really map on easily to our sort of political nomenclature. What it means to be a liberal kind of in contemporary politics is not exactly tied to liberal freedom, and actually sometimes the opposite. And having the conception of freedom that I'm labeling Republican from a philosophical standpoint doesn't mean you should be voting for the Republican Party necessarily. In fact, again, sometimes the opposite. So I just want to put that out as a caveat. One shouldn't think that there's like a direct tie between the liberal conception of freedom and what gets called liberalism in contemporary politics, etc. So the liberal conception of freedom then usually says, well, what it really means to be free is to have the absence of constraints. And what that means then is that if you're going to have laws in a society that say there are things you can and can't do, or things that you have to do, then that's a way of giving up freedom, but in a way that we all agree we have to do and is a good thing. So we all kind of make sacrifices of freedom in order to have a good society. That's the way the liberal or libertarian conception of freedom works, is that we don't have complete freedom actually, but we make sacrifices of freedom in order to have an orderly, just society. The second conception of freedom, which I'm calling Republican, defines freedom as living under a system of non-arbitrary constraints. Now, what that means is that the laws that you live under are good laws. So I'll take a very quick example, and I'm just seeing the time here. I want to move on to Heschel. But let's say I live in New York State, right? I think New York State's like pretty much every state in the United States. New York State requires me to buy car insurance or auto insurance if I own a car, if I drive a car or own a car. I'm required to do that. I think the liberal conception of freedom would say that's a compromise of freedom that I make. It's a constraint on freedom that I make. Whereas the Republican conception of freedom would say, no, that's actually a good law. It's a non-arbitrary law. It imposes a regulation on me that allows for public safety, and because it's not arbitrary, because it's a good law. Actually, having that law is what constitutes my freedom. It's not a sacrifice of freedom. It's actually part of what makes me free is having that law. So it's a very, very different idea about what freedom looks like. So what I've put in the sheet here, right, that this kind of Republican conception of freedom means that the norms and laws that we live by all have some sort of good reason that they serve the common good, and also that and then a more democratic element of this would be that we all have a voice in shaping and revising those constraints, right? Democracy is basically the process by which we all have a say in what the laws should be, and by that we achieve freedom. I don't know that Heschel is really articulating one conception or the other of these two, but I think that his view is consistent with the second one, with the Republican one. Whereas even if he's thinking about freedom more as external constraints, or the absence of external constraints from the political standpoint, then what he's saying is, well, we shouldn't only think about that as freedom. So in a sense, what I think he's arguing in this essay, Religion in a Free Society, is America at its best as a political community creates freedom as the absence of external constraints, that is, the absence of oppression. But that's only on the external side of it. That what we also need is internal freedom. And that internal freedom comes from the observance of Torah. It comes from revelation. It comes from God. And it requires us to do what I'm calling the second conception of freedom of the will. It requires us to actually live according to the good and oppose evil. And not just in our individual lives, but in society as a whole. So in a way, maybe what Heschel is saying is, this is like combining position number one of political freedom, liberal political freedom, with the second conception of freedom of the will. Let's look at some of the texts that he has. So on the bottom of page 1, he says, "We all share a supreme devotion to the hard-won freedom of the American people. Yet to be worthy of retaining our freedoms, we must not lose our understanding of the essential nature of freedom. Freedom means more than mere emancipation. It is primarily freedom of conscience, bound up with an inner allegiance," and that's my emphasis in the bold there. "The danger begins when freedom is thought to consist in the fact that I can act as I desire. This definition not only overlooks the compulsions which often lie behind our desires, it reveals the tragic truth that freedom may develop within itself the seed of its own destruction. The will is not an ultimate and isolated entity, but determined by motives beyond its own control. To be what one wants to be is also not freedom, since the wishes of the ego are largely determined by external factors." So Heschel is engaging here in an analysis of the nature of freedom as the interaction between the political and the psychological dimension. On the political dimension, we may have emancipation, we may have the absence of oppression, we may have the ability to choose our leaders, we may have the ability to shape the way our laws are created in a democratic society. But we also can't then say that freedom consists in being able to do whatever it is that we will. Because what he's worried about is that when we say it that way, that what ends up happening, or what we sort of end up thinking about it, is that we can do just whatever our heart desires, meaning acting on a whim. And he thinks that we really need to embrace the discipline of working towards the good and seeing that as actually constitutive of freedom. That we haven't really achieved freedom in a society where the laws allow us a great deal of choice, but we make bad choices. And when we're talking about bad choices here, we're not talking about second pieces of cheesecake, right? We're talking about harming other people. And we're also talking about failing to live up to our potential, I think, in a much greater sense, right? Making our lives less than the full of their potential dignity, whether that's through our education or through our capacity to show caring for others, or other forms of creative expression through art and culture. I think that's part of what he has in mind as well. So if we look at continuing on the second page, thank you, yes. So if we scroll down there, yes, okay, great. So although political and social freedom must include all this, even the freedom to err, its true essence is in man's ability to surpass himself, even to act against his inclinations and in defiance of his own needs and desires, to sacrifice prejudice even if it hurts, to give up superstition even when it claims to be a doctrine. And notice here that Heschel talks about sacrificing needs and desires and also giving up superstition. So here he's talking about the moral realm and the intellectual realm as well. That is, freedom means having to overcome through our own discernment, overcoming our own propensity towards evil and our own propensity towards falling into superstition. And I think part of what Heschel has in mind here is idolatry, right? Our tendency to think in idolatrous terms, to make gods, right? Idolatry as making gods of things that are not gods. But instead of the sort of the gods of ancient paganism, here I think he's thinking in much more political and cultural terms, the way in which we worship certain things and profess fealty and commitment to things that don't really have absolute value, and yet we treat them as having absolute value, right? So freedom, again, is placing constraints on ourselves that point us towards the good, constraining ourselves from committing evil, constraining ourselves from worshiping false gods. And our real freedom is one when we develop this capacity within ourselves, again, remembering that it's he talks about an inner allegiance, right? So it's an internal process by which we become committed to what's true. We become committed to what's good. And I think what he's trying to say, and I'm cognizant of the time and I won't get through all of the sources, but they're there for you to read. Let's keep the sheet up for now, thank you. What Heschel is saying, I think, is that we can't really have a free society unless the citizens of a free society develop this capacity to overcome our propensity for evil and overcome our propensity for idolatry and commit themselves to the good and to the true. Without that, we can't really have a free society. I think that's really what he's arguing, right? So even though the laws of the society, even though the laws of the land may focus sometimes on the absence of constraints, the real test of freedom are the choices that the citizens of that society make. And however, it's not just whatever choice they want. They have to be choices for the good. So I'm going to just point to a few more texts that show that that's the way that Heschel thinks, but also that he thinks that this is an important idea in Judaism, and that therefore that Judaism's idea of freedom should not only be influential for Jews, but should be influential for American society as a whole. All right, so let's look at a few more texts. So on the screen right now, freedom is the liberation from the tyranny of the self-centered ego. It comes about in moments of transcending the self as an act of spiritual ecstasy, of stepping outside the confining framework of routine, reflexive concern. Freedom presupposes the capacity for sacrifice, right? That phrase there, reflexive concern, concern for myself. He worries, I mean, Heschel's anthropology, his conception of humanity really, is that we do have this tendency to think of ourselves before others, to think of ourselves before what's of absolute value or what's sacred. And so freedom requires actually not that we be able to do whatever we want, but again, the capacity for sacrifice to do what is really meaningful, what's really good, right? Let's skip down to the bottom of page 2. Yeah. The quote on the bottom of page 2, wonderful, thank you. The meaning of freedom is not exhausted by deliberation, decision, and responsibility, although it must include all this, right? So this, if you thinking back to the first conception of freedom, we have to make decisions as human beings, but those decisions are not just whatever decision we make. The meaning of freedom presupposes an openness to transcendence, an openness, I would interpret this as an openness to value beyond just whatever it is that we happen to think. And man has, and continuing with the quotation, man has to be responsive before he can become responsible, right? This beautiful phrasing of Heschel's. For freedom is not an empty concept. Man is free to be free. He is not free in choosing to be a slave. He is free in doing good. He is not free in doing evil. To choose evil is to fail to be free. Now, I just want to focus for a moment on that phrase, choosing to be a slave. I think what he really means is being a slave to our desires, to our impulses, really. And that's a kind of reimposition of slavery, right? Normally, what we think of as slavery is the external constraint. So what here he means, and he's doing it somewhat metaphorically, is slavery as the absence of the internal constraint, absence of that inner conscience that allows us to be free. Let's go to the third page, and I'll just look at one quotation towards the bottom to wrap us up for Shavuot. Yeah, there we go. Thank you. When the voice of God spoke at Sinai, it did not begin by saying, "I am the Lord your God who created heaven and earth." It began by saying, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage." Judaism is not only deliverance from external slavery, but also freedom from false fears and false glories, from fashion, from intellectual will-o'-the-wisps. In our souls, we are subject to causes. In our spirits, we are free, beholding the uncompromising. My last word then is, I think one of the things that we value about a democratic society is that we have different ideas about what might be good in our individual lives. That we have a certain amount of pluralism about how to follow the good. And I think Heschel is actually really celebrating that in a way. But what he's saying is in celebrating the pluralism of a democratic society, we're relying on all of the citizens to really live up to the full potential of their commitment to something good in the world. And that's the only way we can have a free society. So thank you very much. And with that, Chag Sameach. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. That was Rabbi Bill Plevan teaching us. Rabbi Plevan, I want to say especially that I so appreciated how you're able to take these sort of complicated ideas and make them so accessible to all of us. I learned a lot from your teaching. So thank you again for being with us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
I'm going to hand things off to my neighbor in Connecticut, Rabbi Deborah Cantor, to take over the hosting. Chag Sameach, everyone. It's been great being with you.
And I'll unmute. Thanks, Ariella. Thanks for passing the baton. Great to see you.